Hello everyone, welcome back to our Through the Bible series. If you can join me in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 1, we left off concluding the life, lineage, and the after effects of the life and history of Adam, and continuing with the book of Genesis being what it is, introducing our very beginnings, and noting that's what the term Genesis means, the origins. We're going to be discussing another individual who was used by God in a very powerful way and also gave the example of not only what the right people do under the wrong set of circumstances, but also how God has the power to preserve them in the midst of it. So again, Genesis chapter 6 and verse 1, we're going to be discussing the life of Noah. And again, this will be straight from the Bible, not that Gnostic heresy movie garbage that they made with Russell Crowe and going gladiator style. We're actually going to be hearing the original story, so I encourage you, read along with me so you can understand what the original story was like. Verse 1, Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful. And they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And in this we get the summary of the days in the life of what the world was like when Noah was on the face of the earth. This was, again, when mankind was in its prime genetically, when intermarriage between close relatives would not disrupt the genome to the point where having, again, why God established incest as something as immoral, not only because it's a perversion of what he intended marriage to, well, for all intents and purposes, emulate, but also in that regard, to also note that it is unhealthy. The genetic disposition, you could say, splicing between DNA strands that actually have such close relations and all those genomes in common dramatically increase the chances of birth defects, and naturally God wouldn't want that for you. But also noting that we had gotten up to this point where the genome had been spliced out, we understand that there were two groups of individuals on the face of the earth at this time. Those who were the lineage of Seth and those who were the lineage of Cain. And this lineage was not only biological, but moral. Those who were sons of God, establishing and noting that point that was made there, was implying a relationship. And again, if you read the book of Job, which we'll be getting into in the determinate future, you would note that this is a term that's sometimes used to describe angels, but again, it's an implication of a relationship, and there's a whole off-branch interpretation of this that, again, some would interpret as part of this, and I'm going to be presenting both to you. You can decide which one makes the most sense. But concerning the Nephilim, for those of you who played the Diablo series, that's probably a familiar term, but it's not actually referring to a neutral party. The Nephilim is actually a term that means fallen ones, and it was in relation to this doctrine that essentially interprets the sons of God as meaning angels, when the angels, the sons of God, the children, the creations directly descended of spiritual origins, saw that human daughters, the daughters of men, were beautiful, that they intermarried between species and created sort of a supernatural angel mix hybrid, and the result were supernaturally empowered human beings. They were giants. And again, that this was a ploy on Satan's part for God's intention to redeem mankind, since the Bible itself says he offers no help to angels, that God's intention and plan for salvation was to mankind exclusively. And if there was this intermarriage between supernatural creatures who were absent from the salvation of God and mixed with humans, that Satan would basically be getting a one-up with God, and that was the reason for the flood, to purge these Nephilim from the face of the earth. But also noting that there are doctrinal problems with that, as with most of man's interpretations into Scripture beyond what it just plainly says. We read of the Nephilim actually being present during the time of Joshua, and as well you would remember a certain individual in the book of 1 Samuel named Goliath. He was what was implying when it was referring to these giants, not referring to Mount Olympus and Zeus, the giant one-eyed, real fat, 40-foot tall individuals. No, what it was referring to was just men of superior genetics. And that's where the second interpretation goes into this. For all intents and purposes, the lineage and the division of the world morally at this time were the sons and grandsons of Adam and Seth, those who honored God, and those who chose rebellion against God, like Cain and his children. And noting that the example that their grandfathers, so to speak, had left for their kids was, for all intents and purposes, a negative one, to say it lightly. You need to understand that there is no greater influence in our lives than who we choose to marry. And that's why I personally would submit to this. You can choose between whether you think the Nephilim and getting the supernatural mixed in with the physical. That's up to you. You can decide which one of these makes sense. There are plenty of other commentators that would provide more insight on that topic, but I'm going to more focus on the one that I think has more validity in referring to the godly lineage of Seth, the sons of God, and the daughters of men intermarrying, referring to the daughters of men being the daughters, the girls, the children that descended from ungodly lineage, because we would note this as well in the book of Numbers, in the book of Jeremiah, in the book of Isaiah, in the book of Ezekiel, and all these other influences that have a place in our lives, that intermarrying with people who don't share the same spiritual motives as you, do not be. Actually, 2 Corinthians 6:14, Paul directly addresses this. He says, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. That's not referring to an egg. What a yoke was referring to a neck brace set for an ox. It was a secure harness that would allow you to either pull a cart, or it was essentially like Big Macintosh's neck harness. It was meant to help you carry and bear burdens. And his point and emphasis for this is just like Jesus said, take my burden upon you, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light, and I'll give you rest for your souls, referring to him being a carpenter, having experience with making yokes, but also referring to the spiritual goals and burdens of a Christian life, that living to please yourself would ultimately never amount to anything, no matter how hard you pulled or tried. It just wasn't fitted for you. But also noting that God knows your needs, God knows your heart, and also what you were created and intended for. He can actually make a calling in your life that was actually tailor-made and fitted for you. But Paul goes on to emphasize that if you balance your yoke with someone who isn't also fitted to your calling, that it's basically going to be constantly overcompensating and create far more difficulties than it would in just providing more strength to the pull. And he says this, for what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? What communion has light with darkness? And again, the Old Testament minor prophet Joel also goes on to emphasize this point in saying, how can two walk together if they not be agreed on the destination? And in this in mind, the emphasis of what was going on in the world at this time was, while there were good people from good families and learning godly lessons and basically setting the moral standard, and as well there were bad people who had every right to do so. They were given the privilege and free will to rebel against God, but now comes the compromise. Now comes the intermarrying between the good people and the bad people, those who wanted a relationship with God and those who had rejected one, and it began to influence the sons of God in the same way that the children of Israel were influenced by the doctrine of Balaam, which again we'll get into when we discuss the book of Numbers, and further again when we discuss it in Revelation chapter 2, as also having applied to the church. So with it being a consistent theme in Scripture, I stand by that point. And again, it's up to you. But again, going further on into this point, we understand that the fallout of this was God's observation of man, that his imagination, the intents and thoughts of his heart, was only evil continually. And you need to understand that God's desire to redeem man was going to be a voluntary process. And before he could accomplish his will, if we had essentially defaulted before he had even showed up to outright rejecting him because of the influences we had led into our lives, in the pursuit of pleasure, and the pursuit of power, and the pursuit of peace, the ends don't justify the means. And God was essentially saying, not that he can't stand to be around man anymore, but that man more and more is learning to reject him. And that is becoming a problem. Because if he wants to redeem mankind, but mankind doesn't want to be redeemed, what can he do? He set that same policy in place, and the reason why we could be sinful at all. Love implies a choice in the relationship. And Satan was essentially establishing a spirit of bondage that mankind couldn't get out of, and saying that in the pursuit of pleasure and the pursuit of power, like Romans 1 talks about, their eyes and their hearts being blinded, professing to be wise, they became fools and served the creature rather than the Creator. But also going further into this in verse 6, and the Lord was sorry that he made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing, and birds of the air. For I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So understanding that there was one individual that stood out more than anyone else, on the face of the earth at this time, was that there was still one man that could be reserved, that could be spared, that God could still work through because he was still willing to have that relationship. And that's an important thing to remember. God works with those who are willing and available, not those who are special or supernatural. We're going to read towards the end of Noah's life that he was no better than most of us. In fact, probably worse if we compare ourselves to him. But the Bible doesn't talk about a myriadom of super saints. It talks about a mob of very broken and fallen people, much like us, but because God is gracious and he forgives people, we can also look at that in confidence and say, hey, he can use Noah, he can use me. So with this in mind, also understand that when the Bible says that God was sorry that he created man, it implies a form of regret on his part, like he didn't see this coming. You need to understand that with human language and our perspective, we can't understand or fully express, in words, what it is like to, know the mind and understand the nature of God. Because if you know everything, why do you even have to think in the first place? You're just going to do what you naturally know is going to be outcome and result. But if it's even more of a mind blow, you need to also understand that God also knows every alternative outcome that it could have gone on if he didn't choose to do the things, or know the way that the past and the present would work out into the future. And it's just too much for us as human beings to fully understand for God. But when it comes to understanding that God still has a heart, that we can relate to God even in some of the smaller ways in which we've been created in his image, we need to understand that just like God is omniscient, he knows everything, and he's omnipresent, he is everywhere, he's omnipotent, he's all-powerful, that he also has emotions. And even though he knew these things were going to pass, it didn't stop him from being grieved by it, from experiencing the full force of emotions of his creation rejecting him, all but the exception of one family line, and having to watch it happen even though he knew it was going to happen anyway, because 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 8, or verse 7 rather, at the end, love hopes all things, endures all things, and bears all things. So noting that these are definite traits of God's character, understand that it's not that he regretted a decision like, oh, if I had seen this coming, I never would have made them. No, it's using our language to understand and emphasize that God's heart was broken. And that's why that was the term that was used first. He was grieved in his heart. Noting that this was the commonplace in the world at the time, we get an emphasis of the two defining parties. Just like we had Seth and we had Cain, we had those who followed God and those who rejected him. Now we have a further division. And this is the genealogy of Noah, verse 9. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God, and Noah begot 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We'll get more into their impact on our world today, which is significant when we get to chapter 10. But the earth was also corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh has corrupted their way on the earth. So, understand that this was essentially the defining term for what the world was like at this time. Murder, violence, what people wanted to do what they felt like they could do, just outright what seemed right in their own eyes, as the book of Judges says. The definition of anarchy is when everyone does what they think is right instead of what actually is right, and with no moral basis or foundation, because essentially the legacy of families in honoring God or rejecting God had been broken down with all except Jonah. Jonah wouldn't be born for some time. Noah. We also see and have to understand that if the defining term on the face of the earth was essentially a bunch of 4-year-olds who had the bodies of perpetual 700-year-olds, you understand why God was going to lower it down to 120 years, because it was actually a funny observation by an 18th century, I believe, psychologist, or 19th century rather, 1800s, who made the observation that an infant is mankind essentially established in its most selfish form as a delinquent. If they don't get what they want, they go into a murderous fit. But the fortunate aspect of that is that their murderous rages are known as temper tantrums, because it's essentially the attitude and actions of a serial killer sociopath, but in the body of a helpless 2-year-old. So those terrible twos are essentially learning to balance that transition with boundaries and learning to express your emotions properly. Again, we learn expression from our mothers and discipline and boundaries from our fathers, and you can tell in prisons that majority of the individuals who act the most out on these emotions and end up becoming murderers or rapists or any of these other individuals that would be noted as crimes. And again, the defining traits of what was going on in mankind's days at this time were essentially the actions of 4-year-olds in knowing perfectly well how to express their emotions, but because of the absence of a exemplary father, had no discipline or moral structure in which to express these emotions, which is why the family unit was set and completed with a man and a woman, one for life, to establish stability, to set the foundations, and for a child to see the uniqueness of a female and a male and get to express and understand and make up their own minds on the matter of what it's like to have a relationship with God, who is the complete form of both. But also understanding all these amazing and honestly heartbreaking aspects of our human character, we need to understand the definition of maturity is self-control, being, well, for all intents and purposes, expected of ourselves. That the world defined itself as doing whatever was right in their own eyes. If they got angry, they killed someone. If they got sad, they killed themselves. If they, you understand, violence was on the face of the earth, and it was essentially a Tumblr page made manifest. The YouTube comment section was defining the world scene at this time, and for all intents and purposes, this is why God had to put a stop to it, essentially, in putting down a rabid dog. It's showing mercy on the animal just as much as sparing that dog's wrath and rage that's honestly not even its fault at this point. It's just doing what is coming naturally due to the overload of mental stimulation that's going on as a result of this disease. It's also sparing your children who could end up being further victims. And that's what God was doing here. He was putting down a rabid dog, not only because it had made choices that had set itself into a death spiral, so to speak, to use airline terms, but also noting that it was to preserve those who still had a choice, who still had a chance. Because note, Noah, it says he was a just man, perfect in his generations, not in his life or existence. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We're going to, again, emphasizing the point, we'll get to those verses later. But essentially defining what the world did, they did what they felt was right, regardless of the consequences to anyone else. And that sounds like our world today. We also need to note that just because the world's going this way, we don't have to, because what defined Jonah? Well, Jonah and his family followed the standard that God expected of man, which was honestly pretty fair. Micah chapter 6 and verse 8 says, "He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God?" And that was essentially what was defining Jonah's life. He walked with God. He was perfect in his generations. He was a just man. He's just asking you to be fair. He's just asking you to honor him and respect his authority. He's just asking you to be the kind of person who wants to show mercy, just like they'd want to be shown mercy. We'd like to be shown mercy ourselves. Now that might offend you. You might say, well, I don't want to be fair. If I get something wrong done to me, I want, them to get the electric chair. But if I do something wrong, I want mercy because the world revolves around me. Maybe that's the way you live. I can't control whether or not you get to make up your mind. God gave you that privilege. But here's the thing. I'd rather take the route that ended up lasting more than 120 years and then ending for eternity. I'd rather focus on one that ends up lasting forever, don't you? With that being held in mind. Verse 13. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms inside the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch, with tar, with this essential bonding adhesive. And this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, its height 30 cubits, and you shall make a window for the ark. And you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and set the door of the ark in its side. You shall make it with a lower and second and third decks, and behold, I myself am bringing flood waters on the earth, to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I shall establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every sort to the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds after their kind, of animals after their kind, and of every creeping thing of the earth after its kind. 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive, and you shall take for yourself all food that is eaten, and you shall gather it to yourself, and it shall be done for you and for them. Thus Noah did according to all that God had commanded him, so he did. So noting this is also why Noah is included in the Hall of Fame of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11, of someone who heard God's word and trusted it, because it's one thing for us to actually hear the voice of God, it's another thing to respond to it. Plenty of people receive altar calls but don't respond to them. Plenty of people grew up in the church but never do anything with it. Plenty of people sit in church Sunday morning but then go to a strip club afterwards, and it applies nothing further to their lives whatsoever. Let not it be said among you. But also noting that this was the defining term as to what Noah was going through. Understand, there was a measure of faith to be had here. Noah was living in a world where, as you remember in Genesis chapter 2, that the earth and its atmosphere was probably like 7 times thicker than it was now, and the earth was perpetually in this springtime haze season where the world was perpetually watered with a mist that fell every day. It had never rained before. God came to Noah and said, it's going to rain. I want you to build an ark. Here's its dimensions, and I want you to gather the animals. So Noah, to quote Bill Cosby on this, went, right. What's a cubit? If you're wondering, that's the length between a man's forearm and his elbow, approximately 18 inches. But noting that he gave him the dimensions, the designs, and whoever came up with the fact that Noah had to gather these animals, God would gather them into the ark. He would do Evan Almighty was more accurate than we give it credit for as far as the operating procedure. He built it, God filled it. But noting this as well, we get a summary and observation here of what it means to be in a time where God's judgment is imminent, which we find ourselves in the world today. You need to understand that his standard operating procedure for judging sin always fell into this exact category, and I want to go over these with you. The first step was always a prophetic warning, that God would give warning far in advance that you were doing something that had consequences, and if you continued in them, there would be a price to pay. And I think that's, for all intents and purposes, what you'd call fair. God gave warning before he disciplined. He just doesn't go, I smite thee because I can. because certainly he has the right to do so, but because he loves you, he gives you the privilege and opportunity to turn around and not continue to let these mistakes define and destroy you and those around you. So a prophetic warning came first. The second step was providing a means of escape that is available to everyone. And here's the part that I think the modern-day Noah movie messed up the most. Noah was not to keep people from going into the ark. When God said, you, your wife, your sons, and their wives were welcome into the ark, he was just predicting in advance, knowing already who'd respond to it. Just like God said that a majority of people will go the way of destruction and few will find the way of life. It wasn't the way he wanted it to be. He just knows that's the way it's gonna be. The ark was essentially a 100-year building project in which Noah was not only a construction worker, but a minister of righteousness and a prophet, which we'll be reading verbatim in future passages. But also noting that these things are important to remember as the foundation of God's heart, that when he's going to judge sin, he doesn't want to include the sinner in the process. He wants to judge the crime, not the criminal. That's why he took their crimes on himself, so that we could go away innocent and free. He can't be unjust, but he can be the justifier. And that's the nature of God we need to understand, is that when he judges sin, it's always to spare life, not to end it. And that was the motive and goal of this. And the third step in operating procedure in judging sin was for God's people to be taken out of harm's way, which they did. When the rain waters fell, God closed the door and the people were preserved through the ark. God provided a means of escape. And then step 4. Yeah, he judged sin and it wasn't pretty. And if you guys need further examples of how this looked out in future generations, and again examples, I want to first point out to you Sodom and Gomorrah. And this was a standard operating procedure and scenario where God went through these 4 steps with people. They rejected it. God's people were spared, and the city was destroyed. We now see the remaining crater of Sodom and Gomorrah now, known as the Dead Sea, being literally incinerated by what we can tell by the ancient diggings underneath and inside the Dead Sea, because it's just so sulfurically included in salt with all of the asphalt and tar pits that were around those regions. It was essentially as if one giant lightning bolt superheated the region because it left a crater of just petrified salt. With all of these things being proof of God's not only intervention, but we use history not to confirm the Bible, we use the Bible to confirm history. We see that this is just how it went down, that God sent 2 angels to warn Sodom and Gomorrah of its evil. Provided a prophetic warning. The city tried to rape the angels. There you go. Step 2. Lot was told to get him and his family and everyone else who would listen. Because note, we're going to read later on in Genesis that Lot, who is the nephew of Abraham, who again we'll be reading about more in his coming on the scene in Genesis chapters 11 through 20. Abraham's nephew Lot was not what you'd call a righteous man by any means, and we'll go further into his life in that regard. But noting that he feared God in his heart, God told him, his wife, and his daughters, get out of here. God's going to destroy the city. They've been given a warning, and they actively rejected it. They continue with the homosexual parades, and judgment is about to fall. That's literally what was happening. And with these activists going around in the street, Lot tried to convince also his daughters' husbands, his sons-in-law, to also leave the city with him, but they didn't listen. So prophetic warning was given, and it was rejected. A means of escape was provided. It was rejected. The angels told Lot to get out of the city. So they did. And then Lot escaped, and Sodom and Gomorrah were turned into the Dead Sea. We can pretty much assume from that. As well as wife didn't obey the means at which God had provided to escape at the last second and got incinerated and turned into a pillar of salt whether that means she was crushed by falling debris, having looked back and not getting away fast enough, or it was actually a supernatural result of the power of God manifesting itself and destroying the city completely. We don't know. We'll go into more detail when we actually get to that passage, but we also see another example of more positive results. You guys remember again the person I mispronounced Noah as Jonah and his judgment on Nineveh. God sent Jonah, reluctantly, to Nineveh to warn them of the coming judgment of their sin. And note, Nineveh was, for all intents and purposes, where they perfected the art of torturing people. They had a lot coming to them. And when they found out that what they were doing was wrong and displeased the true and living God, the whole city asked God for forgiveness. So step one, prophetic warning was given through a very reluctant prophet nonetheless, but still. A means of escape was provided. They asked God to forgive them. God's people were spared. All those who asked for forgiveness were forgiven. God spared the city. Judgment fell on everyone who deserved it and who hadn't taken advantage of the opportunity to get out of it while they still could, which was nobody. God judged sin the same way. He gave a means of escape. Everyone took advantage of it. Therefore, no one got judged. Now, again, the book of Nahum also will talk about their grandkids, the future generations of Nineveh, who ended up being judged for the same things, but because they already had known better, received a prophetic warning, and then ignored it, didn't learn from the mistakes of their parents, that they were held under the same regard and faced the same consequences. But we'll get into that when we get to the book of Nahum. And then we also can see another example up and coming in the future of our world today, that God sent Jesus to save the world from its sin. Some are choosing to come, choose a saving relationship with Jesus Christ, to put their trust in Him, to accept the means at which God has given them the escape from our inevitable judgment of sin through separation from Him forever, and as well during the tribulation period. And most are choosing to ignore it, which is the same scenario as which it was most of the time in the Bible, unfortunately. God will take His people out through the rapture. The book of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and 1 Corinthians 15, verses 50 through 55, which we'll read in future dates and passages. And again, I'd be more than happy to go with you in more detail if I had more time, but I value yours, so I will express and get through this. God will provide a means of escape by taking His people out before judgment falls. He has not predestined us for wrath, but for salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. And then the tribulation will begin, and then the world will be judged of its sin. And all those who missed the means of escape, again, if you guys have seen the Left Behind movie with Kirk Cameron and Nicolas Cage, both, regardless of your opinions as to the quality or caliber of those movies, were an accurate representation of the immediate fallout of those who missed the boat, literally. And with this in mind, I want to continue into chapter 7, and noting that for the last 100 years, God let Noah not only build this ark, but be a living example and illustration of saying a means has been given for you to escape the coming judgment of sin on the earth, which was fair. God gave them 100 years to not only get this message out, in the same regard as to why God's given us, at the time of this recording, 1,981 years to call and convince anyone who wants a relationship with Jesus to take it before they have to end up paying for the things that they've outright rejected, and facing the consequences that come naturally to all of us who have sinned, who have rejected a relationship with God, and facing the fallout of those choices. But noting that God's patience isn't his approval, as some would interpret it. God's patience isn't His ignorance. God's patience with our sin is not Him changing His mind about judging us when the clock hit 0 and we have not taken advantage of it. Judgment will fall. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Come into the ark, you and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. You shall take with you 7 of every clean animal, male and female, 2 of each of animals that are unclean, male and his female. Also 7 of each of the birds of the air, male and female. And note this, to keep the species alive on the face of the earth. So note, it wasn't every single type. It was every single kind of animal. So there weren't 2 Labrador retrievers, 2 Siberian Huskies, 2 dachshunds, and 2 cockapoos, for crying out loud. It was 2 dogs, male and female. And noting that these would be essentially the prime genus of dog and the species of dog that would then, naturally, the world being one naturally formed environment, would be the primary genus of what all dogs would originate from, that this species would then, after the flood, we get introduced to seasons and different climates, deserts, tundras, and all those other different bipolar aspects of these things. And noting that the world would then function with cycles like we know they do today, as opposed to back then when it was just consistent spring haze. The dogs would then adapt to their environments, and note, not over a span of millions of years, but over a span of probably a few generations, as we've naturally seen with snowshoe hares being able to adapt to the genetic basically adaptation and how they respond to natural body heat. They are able to produce brown-colored fur to allow them to camouflage between soil and trees, and that also during winter, when it gets colder, their capillaries produce white fur so they can blend in with the snow during winter seasons. And noting that Siberian Huskies are dogs that have adapted to the environment and mountainous terrain of Siberia, of Russia. We also see dachshunds, field dogs that have been more adept at hunting down and catching gophers, animals that would be burrowing down. And as well, golden retrievers, hunting dogs, and more of a prime genus muscular and obedient, domesticated type of creature, as opposed to wild wolves who are more used to high velocity speed and chases. Their muscles, their genetic disposition has adapted from the main genus, which is that of a dog. And the reason why I'm again espousing structural adaptation as opposed to the theory of the transition from one species to another as being totally different ideas. Understand, I'm not discounting evolution in regards to, well, for all intents and purposes, the Pokemon sense of it, that regardless of whether or not you started with a Charmander, it's regardless of whether it turns to a Charmeleon, a Charizard, or you give it the Everstone and it stays as a Charmander, it's always going to be based off of that type. It's going to be a fire type Pokemon. Whether it adapts flying type traits or you give it a Mega Stone and it becomes Dragon type and gains the ability of Tough Claws. Again, for those of you who know and understand these concepts, you can relate to me here. But again, a dog's always going to be a dog. You don't have any examples, at least honest ones, and that is, of one species transitioning, a fish turning into a salamander, and a salamander turning into another type of creature, and thus resulting into the human beings we are today. We see types of creatures who take on the traits of others, but ultimately they remain the same. The only proof that they have of this, of any actual examples, was actually a bacterium that developed viral traits. But then when you ask them outright, well, was it still a bacteria? Oh yeah, it just acted like a virus. Well, I'm a human, but if I adapt the traits of a dog, that's called lycanthropy. And it doesn't mean I've transformed into a werewolf. It means I'm a human, but I behave like an animal. It doesn't change my genetic disposition at all. Now note, I'm hairier than most, and that's actually another example. My ancestors being Nordic, Norwegian, Swedish, Finnish, and the like, and Russian. I myself am just Swedish and Dutch, but take with that what you will. Again, blurring. My ancestors are more hairy than most people, and that doesn't mean I'm subhuman. And just like in the same way, I have friends who have more melanin in their skin, thus giving them a darker appearance and tone, which means they are more adept to live for longer periods and with more exposure to sunlight without the risk of skin cancer. We're all still human. Just because we look or act different, we still have those same origins, and we're all based from the same creator. Understand, that's the establishment of value, and any Christian who would claim to be as such and be a and suppose themselves to true racism, and note not the media's definition of it, where you just disagree with someone and that's their buzzword to get you to shut up. I mean, someone who looks down on someone who's different than you, that's ridiculous. But also understand as well, the preservation of these species, there were 7 of the clean, but also 2 of the unclean. They had a necessary role in creation, but just as well, the mosquitoes having a role in purifying water, the introduction to disease would mean there should be less of them than there would be of, say, hummingbirds and bumblebees, and things that would actually end up preserving more necessary aspects of nature than those who, because of the result of the fall, would end up creating more consequences and contributing than there would. So again, bugs and all those different things, they would be preserved through this ark. And again, just briefly going through these things, how did Noah keep track of all these animals? What stopped them from killing each other? Well, first off, no one ate meat before the time of the flood. Second thing is the emphasis and making of hibernation. You think that God could have put these animals in a deep sleep and made them incredibly docile? Also, for the storage, we understand that the capacity and have the actual dimensions of the ark mentioned to us back in verses 15 through 17. But also, with all these things in regard in mind, we would do well not to look at the minutiae to try and disprove these principles of Scripture, and rather actually learn from them and understand that just like Ken Ham goes to great lengths to emphasize these points and answers in Genesis, his debate with Bill Nye was a farce, to say it best. I've listened to actual theological debates, and that was just a joke, and yet so many people deify Bill Nye without actually knowing that he's not even a scientist. He has a bachelor's in engineering. And also noting that Ken Ham is a very experienced scholar on the matter. It's not whether or not you have the facts or information, it's what you're willing to do with them, and that's the most important thing. I can give you this information and give you valid proof as to the historical validity of all of these things, the times, the locations, the dates. The foundation of our genetic disposition as a human race having genetically originated from these 3 individuals, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But it's ultimately whether or not you want to accept it that really matters. So again, continuing. If you want to continue with the people who perished in the flood, you'll get what they got. But the same thing is also true. If you want to take God at His word when He gives it to you, He preserves the righteous. And I'd rather last longer than just think I'm right and live happier. So also noting, after 7 more days, so, final curtain call, I will cause it to rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, 40 being a symbolic number of judgment. And I will destroy from the face of the earth all living things that I have made. And Noah did according to all that the Lord commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters were on the earth. Now, a lot of people consider this a contradiction and saying, I thought it said at the beginning of chapter 6 that manwood's days would only be 120. That would be after this event, because it was right as this was being announced that the days of man would be considerably shortened. And why? Well, we'll go into it. So Noah and his sons, his wife, his sons' wives went into the ark because of the waters of the flood. Of clean animals, of animals that are unclean, of birds, of everything that creeps on the earth, 2 by 2 they went into the ark to Noah, male and female, as God had commanded Noah. And it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were on the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month. Now again, this is going off the Hebrew calendar. They base the moon off of how they determine the months. Our Gregorian or Babylonian calendar refers to the sun. Our first month is January, but the first Hebrew month was Nisan. So the 2nd month, Nisan is in around April or March, varying. Again, we have a leap year. They have leap months. So the 2nd month would be in either May or June is when this would be happening. The 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, 17th day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So note, this flood wasn't just a rainstorm that didn't quit. It was a supernatural delusion of water. It, again, is knowledge known to us from the book of Genesis that the atmosphere was much thicker, much virile, and much more, was able to retain a lot more moisture, and thus protected us from a lot more of the sun's harmful rays like ultraviolet radiation, which is then resulting the mutation of cells and the failure to be able to continue to produce them at a rate enough that supports our bodies, which we would refer to as the term growing old. So when God said man's days would be 120 years, the resulting collapse of basically 2/3 of the atmosphere would bring in enough radiation and sunlight that it would shorten mankind's lifespan considerably, almost down to 1/10 of what it should have been. And also intended with this, we also understand that it wasn't just coming from down, or from above down to the ground, it was also coming from below under the earth. The continents were cracking and splitting, and the waters were dividing the nations. We have the term Pangea, referring to the uniting of the continents when you are able to fit together all the nations having slowly been drifted apart. It was probably a more drastic and dramatic event than we give it credit for. The forming of, well, finding sea-bearing fossils on the top of mountains, and as well the formations of the Grand Canyon being the natural product of very dramatic and drastic events. We have the evidence of the flood all around us, but again, that's up to you as to whether or not you're going to use that information. So the reason why we don't live as long as these individuals who lived over 600 to almost 1,000 years old, if you include Methuselah, who's a special case, God kept him alive as the final day and note countdown as to when God would judge the earth. Again, Methuselah was the time bomb, and we talked about that in Genesis chapter 5. But also noting on that very same day, Noah and Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wife and the three wives of his sons with them, entered the ark. They and every beast after its kind, all cattle after their kind, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth after its kind, every bird after its kind, every bird of every sort. So again, the distinction between species of land animals was distinctive, the birds a little bit more spread out. And they went into the ark to Noah, 2 by 2, of all flesh, which has the breath of life. So those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded them. That's who gathered them, God. And the Lord shut him in. He's the one who closed the door, not man. It's not to us to predict the day when God will take his church out. It's up to us to be ready for when he calls us in. Remember that. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days. The waters increased and lifted up the ark. It rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and all the mountains were covered. Wow. So 15 cubits, that would be 18 times 15. You can do the math and convert that to feet from the highest peak of even the mountains like Mount Everest. It's deeper than that. All flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, cattle, and beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, all that was on the dry land died. So he destroyed the living things who were on the face of the earth, both man and cattle, creeping thing and bird of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. Now note, I doubt the fish noticed, but the land animals certainly did. It's probably why there's over 8 billion different species of fish and only 1/10 of that on the land. But again, in chapter 8, actually, emphasis and time out. The flood, chronologically, we know from this, lasted over a year. And noting that this would be time where the family would get a lot more together time than they would ever have imagined. We also need to understand that the 40 days and the 40 nights were how long the rain lasted, but the water stayed and sedated itself there for over a year. And with these details being given to us about well, how the atmosphere would function, we then get into the restoration project after sin had fallen, after judgment had fallen. And God remembered Noah. Not like he forgot, but it was time for the waters to begin receding, and every living thing on the animals that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. And the waters receded continually from the earth at the end of the 150 days. The waters decreased, so 150 days. Then the ark rested in the 7th month, the 7th day of the month, and on the mountains of Ararat. That would be in what we know today as kind of central eastern Turkey, but noting that this total mathematic counting of how long the flood would have lasted at this point would be a year and 10 days by our modern counting. So the waters decreased continually until the 10th month, and in the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. So emphasis on that. So it came to pass at the end of the 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made, and he sent out a raven, which kept going to and fro until the waters had dried up from the earth. Again, ravens are carrion birds. They would eat the corpses, and that would essentially be the establishment of their diet from then onward. But he also sent out from himself a dove to see if the waters had receded from the face of the ground. Again, carrion birds, they could just perch on a corpse. But a dove would be a test to see if life was ready, if ground was sustainable. They could establish themselves with ground. But the dove found no resting place for the sole of her foot, and she returned to the ark to him. So again, nowhere was habitable for the dove, but plenty for the raven. So the dove came back, the raven didn't. He had plenty of food. The dove, not so much. So he put out his hand and took her, and drew her into the ark to himself. And he waited again yet another 7 days. And again he set the dove out from the ark. Then the dove came to him in the evening, and behold, a freshly plucked olive leaf was in her mouth. Oh, so it wasn't just enough the waters had receded, things were beginning to grow again. And Noah knew the waters had receded from the earth. So he waited yet another 7 days, and sent out the dove, which did not return to him again any more. And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the 1st month, of the 1st day of the month, that the waters had dried up from the earth. So, 1st year. Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. And in the 2nd month, and the 27th day of the month, the earth was dried. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, Go out to the ark, you and your wife, your sons and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and cattle, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may abound on the earth, be fruitful and multiply on the earth. So have lots of babies and repopulate. That's your calling from me. So Noah went out, and his sons and his wives and his sons' wives with him, every animal, every creeping thing, every bird, and whatever creeps on the earth according to their families, went out of the ark. Then God built an altar to the Lord, took of every clean animal and every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Then the Lord smelled a soothing aroma, the barbecue. And the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, truer said, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. So instead of being a perpetual daytime, we would now have the transition from day to night, just like we would have a perpetual springtime, we would transition from harvest to winter. We would transition from summer, the hot days to the cold days. We would have seed time, the time to plant, the time to gather, the time to work, the time to rest, the time for the land to rejuvenate itself, and the time for the land to essentially provide for itself. And with all these things, we get the emphasis of the world that we have today being founded on the principle that God has judged it, but also on the promise that God would never do so in that manner again. So God blessed Noah and his sons, chapter 9 and verse 1, and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, and all that moves on the earth, and on all flesh and all the sea. They are given into your hand. So up until this time, animals weren't afraid of people. They didn't attack them. Not anymore. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. Not until this time man could sustain himself without meat. Now our nutrition and essentially the resulting breakdown of a third of the atmosphere collapsing, or more than a third, would then result in a natural fallout of man's relations between him and his creation, but also noting that we would be able to eat green herbs. Now the necessary supply of protein and meat has been commanded by God, but also, as we will go on in the book of Exodus and Leviticus, the parameters as to which animals are healthy to eat and which aren't. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. So again, establishing of kosher laws before the Jewish people, that the healthy way to eat these animals would be to properly bleed them first. God gave these commandments in health. He didn't explain to them the germ or bacterial theory. He just said, trust me, I made this. I know what's going to be good for you. And he gave instructions, just like when he gave us the gift of sexual intimacy. It's not a toy to be played with. You can get very sick, and there could be a lot of consequences if you don't use it properly. So what you eat, it's a gift. I want you to enjoy it, but in the right way. So, but you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is its blood, for surely your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it, and from the hand of man. From the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, from man's blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. So essentially, not only do we establish the first dietary laws to the people that would be populating the earth, so all their kids would know, all of us would know how to eat, how to act. The first moral laws. If you kill someone, you'll be killed. Capital punishment being established and vindicated by God. Because life is mine, you don't take it, I do. And if you take it, it's into their hand to take yours. Now verse 7, as for you, their calling, their goal, what they were required to do by God according to his will and plan in those days was, be fruitful and multiply. And note, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, all that were on the face of the earth was them and their wives. They would have sons, they would have daughters, they would get married. They would have sons, they would have daughters, they would intermarry. But once the genome had been split out enough, then would be the establishment and ethical rules and laws in genetics that God would place into where it was safe, where it was healthy, and where it was ethical to marry within family relations. Then God spoke to Noah and his sons with him, saying, as for me, behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, that all go out of the ark, every beast of the earth. Thus I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I make with me and you and every living creature that is with you. For perpetual generations I set my rainbow in the cloud. At the end of every storm, we see a reminder that God is not going to continue to let it rain on the earth like it once did. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. This is the sign. It shall be when I bring a cloud over the earth that the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant that which is between me and between every living thing of all flesh. All the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. The rainbow shall be in the cloud, and I will look on it to remember and remind you that, let the rainbow remind you, right? The lasting, everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. So essentially, again, my emphasis and point as to why Rainbow Dash was chosen on purpose is the element of loyalty. The rainbow was God's first promise to man, that by this sign you know that I always keep my promises, that the rains will stop. They will not continue perpetually and flood the entire planet. Now note, we still do have flash floods, natural result of a fallen world and rebelling against God. But with these perversions happening in nature, we can know that God does keep his promises. He is the element of loyalty. He founded the concept.